What if the greatest democracy the world had ever seen was never truly free? What if behind the marble columns, behind the philosophers debating justice in sunlit squares, behind the vote of every citizen in the assembly, there was something else entirely? A shadow, a network, a brotherhood so powerful, so deeply embedded in the fabric of Athenian society, that no politician could rise without its blessing. No general could march without its approval. No law could pass without its knowledge. They met in darkness. They spoke in symbols. They bound their members with oaths so severe that breaking them was considered worse than death itself. And yet, almost no history book mentions them by name. Because the most effective secret is not one that is hidden. It is one that hides in plain sight. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the most powerful secret society in the ancient world, the brotherhood that operated at the very heart of Athenian democracy and may have ultimately destroyed it. What you are about to hear has been buried for 2,000 years. It is time to listen. In 507 BC, a politician named Cleisthenes introduced a radical new system of government to the city of Athens. He called it democratia, the rule of the people. For the first time in recorded history, citizens were given a direct voice in the decisions of their city. They could vote on laws. They could elect generals. They could even vote to exile any individual they deemed too powerful, a process called ostracism, where citizens scratched a name onto a pottery shard, and the most voted name was expelled from the city for 10 years. It was, by any measure of the ancient world, revolutionary. Athens became a beacon, a model, a city that other Greeks looked at with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, because nothing quite like it had ever existed before. But democracy, as Athens practiced it, was never quite what it appeared to be. First, the obvious limitations. Women could not vote. Slaves, who comprised perhaps a third of the entire population, had no rights whatsoever. Foreign residents, no matter how long they had lived in Athens, were permanently excluded from political life. So already, the gleaming vision of democratic Athens begins to crack around the edges. But there was something else, something less visible, something that the official histories of Athens, written by the winners, by the powerful, by the very men who benefited from the system, almost never discussed directly. Beneath the surface of Athenian democracy, there existed a parallel structure of power, a network of influence that operated not through votes or laws or open debate, but through secrecy, ritual, and the quiet, absolute authority of brotherhood. To understand this shadow network, we must first understand the world that created it. Athens, in the 5th century BC, was not just a city. It was an empire. It controlled a vast network of allied and subject states across the Aegean, extracting tribute, projecting military power, and accumulating wealth on a scale that no Greek city had ever achieved before. With that wealth came competition. With that competition came desperation. And with desperation came the need for advantages that the public arena could not provide. The secret societies of Athens were not born from evil. They were born from ambition. And in Athens, ambition had no ceiling. The ancient Greeks had a word for them, heterai. It translates roughly as clubs or associations, but that translation strips away almost everything that made them significant. A hetaira was not a social club. It was not a gathering of friends who shared an interest in poetry or wine, though wine was certainly involved, and poetry was sometimes used as a code. A hetaira was a sworn brotherhood of men, bound by mutual obligation, shared secrets, and a collective commitment to advancing the interests of their members, by any means necessary. They were everywhere in Athens. Every significant political figure of the classical period was connected to at least one. Many were connected to several. Membership was exclusive and carefully controlled. You did not apply to join a hetaira. You were selected, vetted, observed over months or years before being approached, and when the approach came, It came quietly, a word in a private moment, an invitation to a dinner that turned out to be something rather more significant than a dinner. The initiation rituals varied between groups, but common elements appear across multiple ancient sources. Oaths were sworn, not to the gods in the abstract, but to specific, named deities, invoking divine punishment for betrayal. The penalties described for oath-breaking were severe enough to make even hardened Athenian politicians pale. Information was shared within the hetaeria that was shared nowhere else. Political intelligence, financial dealings, the private weaknesses of rivals, the location of hidden wealth, the identity of informants. In a city where political survival depended on knowing what your enemies were planning before they planned it, this information was not merely useful. It was everything. The hetaeria operated across every layer of Athenian society, but their real power was concentrated at the top. The most influential clubs counted among their members generals, archons, the chief magistrates of Athens, wealthy merchants whose ships controlled the grain supply, and the kind of men whose names appear on the inscriptions of public buildings because they donated just enough to be celebrated without revealing quite how much more they had kept. These were not fringe figures. These were not conspiracy theorists meeting in caves. These were the men who built the Parthenon, who commanded the fleet at Salamis, who wrote the laws that governed every Athenian citizen. And they had a second set of rules that no one else knew about. In the summer of 415 BC, Athens woke up to a city in shock. Overnight, someone, or a coordinated group of someones, had systematically mutilated every herm in the city. The hermae were stone pillars topped with the head of the god Hermes, placed at doorways, street corners, and public spaces throughout Athens. They were sacred objects, religious symbols that marked boundaries and protected travelers. Touching one without cause was considered impious. Deliberately mutilating one was, in Athenian law and Athenian religion, an act of profound sacrilege. Every single herm in Athens had been defaced in a single night. The city did not merely react with anger. It reacted with terror. Because this was not random vandalism. The scale, the coordination, the precision required to hit every significant herm in a city the size of Athens in a single night. This required organization. It required planning. It required a network. And Athens knew exactly what kind of network was capable of something like this. The timing was not coincidental. Athens was on the eve of its most ambitious military expedition ever. The invasion of Sicily, a massive gamble that its supporters believed would extend Athenian power across the entire Mediterranean. Someone had chosen this moment deliberately. Someone wanted to destabilize the city, to create panic, to delay or derail the expedition, to send a message. The investigation that followed was one of the most frenzied and politically charged in Athenian history. Informants came forward, some genuine, some opportunistic, some clearly fabricating stories to settle personal scores. Names were named. Arrests were made. Several prominent Athenians fled the city rather than face trial. Among those implicated, though he ultimately escaped conviction, was one of the most famous men in Athenian history, Alcibiades. Brilliant, charismatic, wildly ambitious, connected to virtually every significant hetaeria in Athens. A man who seemed to embody everything Athens was at its most extraordinary and everything it was at its most dangerous. Alcibiades denied involvement in the mutilation of the herms, but the accusations against him went further. He was also accused of something that, in Athens, was considered even more serious. He was accused of profaning the Eleusinian mysteries. To understand why this accusation was so devastating, we must understand what the Eleusinian mysteries were. Every year, in the autumn, tens of thousands of people made a sacred pilgrimage from Athens to the town of Eleusis, 14 miles to the west. They came from across the Greek world, and later, from across the Roman world as well. Ordinary citizens and emperors alike, soldiers and philosophers, men and women, slaves and free people. The mysteries were one of the few institutions in the ancient world that transcended social boundaries. What happened at Eleusis was never written down. This is not an accident of history. It was not that the records were lost or destroyed. The initiates, the mysti, were bound by an oath of absolute secrecy so severe that in 2,000 years of ancient literature, no initiate ever directly revealed the central secret of the rites. We know the broad outlines. The initiates fasted. They drank a special ritual beverage called the kykeon, a mixture of water, barley, and mint, which some modern researchers believe may have contained psychoactive compounds derived from ergot fungus. They processed by torchlight. They witnessed something, some dramatic ritual enactment, that ancient sources describe only as deeply transformative. Cicero, the Roman orator and statesman, was initiated at Eleusis. He wrote that the mysteries had taught him not merely to live with more joy, but to die with better hope. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius was initiated, the playwright Sophocles, the philosopher Plato. Whatever happened in that inner sanctuary at Eleusis, it was considered the most profound religious experience available to a human being in the ancient world, and Alcibiades was accused of staging a private mockery of these rites, of performing a parody of the sacred ceremony at a dinner party, surrounded by his hetairae, drunk and laughing. In Athens, this was not merely a religious offense. It was treason against the soul of the city. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Alcibiades was recalled from the Sicilian expedition, the very campaign he had championed, to face trial. Rather than return, he defected to Sparta. The man who had been the most powerful figure in Athenian politics, the darling of the Hetairai, the brilliant general who was supposed to lead Athens to Mediterranean dominance, walked into the court of Athens's greatest enemy and began advising them on how to defeat his own city. The secret societies of Athens had produced their most spectacular failure, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The Sicilian expedition ended in catastrophe. The entire Athenian fleet, 200 ships, 40,000 men, was destroyed. It was one of the greatest military disasters in ancient history. Athens lost an entire generation of its finest soldiers and sailors in a single, catastrophically mismanaged campaign. The city reeled. Its treasury was depleted. Its allies began to reconsider their loyalties. Sparta, armed with the intelligence provided by the treacherous Alcibiades, pressed its advantage relentlessly. And in this moment of maximum vulnerability, the Hetairai made their move. In 411 BC, a coordinated conspiracy among the most powerful secret clubs in Athens executed a coup d'état. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of political manipulation. The conspirators did not storm the assembly with weapons. They did not march soldiers through the streets, not at first. Instead, they used the tools they had spent decades perfecting: information, intimidation, and the quiet, suffocating pressure of organized power. Key democratic leaders were assassinated, quietly, in ways that sent a message without triggering immediate retaliation. Informants who might have exposed the conspiracy were silenced. Moderate politicians were approached privately and offered a choice: join us, or face the consequences of standing against us. When the assembly met to vote on the new constitutional arrangements, the atmosphere was one of barely concealed terror. Ancient sources record that no one rose to oppose the measures being put forward, not because they agreed, but because several prominent men had already been killed for speaking out, and everyone in that assembly knew it. The democracy that Cleisthenes had built, that Athens had bled to defend against Persia, that had produced the Parthenon, and the tragedies of Sophocles, and the philosophy of Socrates, was suspended. In its place, a council of 400 men, drawn almost entirely from the Hetairai, assumed control of the city. The secret societies of Athens had stopped being shadows. They had stepped into the light, and what they revealed when they did, was not enlightenment. It was hunger. The regime of the 400 lasted less than a year. It collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The conspirators could not agree among themselves on how to govern. The Athenian fleet refused to recognize the new regime, and popular resistance in the city proved more resilient than the Hetarii had calculated. Democracy was restored. The leaders of the coup were tried, exiled, or executed. But Athens was never quite the same. The city that had defeated Persia, that had built the Parthenon, that had given the world Socrates and Sophocles and Thucydides, that city had looked into the mirror and seen something it could not unsee. It had seen how fragile democracy truly was, how easily it could be hollowed out from within by organized, patient, ruthless men who understood that power was not found in public speeches or democratic votes, but in the quiet rooms where the real decisions were made. Athens recovered. But the wounds left by the Hetarii never fully healed. In 404 BC, just 7 years after the coup of the 400, Athens fell to Sparta, the 30 tyrants, another oligarchic regime with deep connections to the old Hetarii networks, seized control and unleashed a reign of terror that killed 1,500 Athenian citizens in 8 months. Among those who survived was a young man who had watched all of this unfold with wide, horrified eyes. A young man who had seen what happened when secret networks of power operated without accountability, who had watched his teacher, a philosopher named Socrates, be put to death by a democratic assembly driven to hysteria by political manipulation. That young man went away and wrote some of the most important political philosophy in human history. His name was Plato. And his central question, the question that runs through every dialogue, every argument, every carefully constructed thought experiment, was the same question that the Hetarii had forced upon Athens. Who should hold power? And what happens when those who hold it refuse to be seen? The Hetarii of ancient Athens are gone. Their oaths have dissolved. Their secrets have mostly died with them. Their meeting places are dust beneath 2,000 years of history. But the questions they raise are permanent. Every democracy that has ever existed has struggled with the same tension that destroyed Athens, the tension between the power that is visible, the votes, the laws, the public institutions, and the power that is not, the power that operates in private rooms, through personal relationships, through the slow accumulation of favors and debts and shared secrets. Athens called these networks Hetarii. Every age has its own name for them. The ancient world is not as distant as we like to believe. Its failures are our inheritance. Its warnings are still speaking, if we are willing to listen. This has been Whispers of Athens. If this journey has unsettled you, challenged you, or made you see the ancient world differently, subscribe, leave a comment, tell us what you think. Because the shadows of Athens have not finished speaking, and we are only just beginning to listen.